But all right, this morning it will be an orange Thursday morning with Torah. Also, although this is not your problem, and I acknowledge that this is not your problem or your issue, I had an international, it's called the Abrahamic Faith Initiative, an international meeting with religious leaders from across the world this morning, and it started at 6 a.m. and it went from 6 to now. So I've been on Zoom for 3 hours, which means that I have almost exhausted my Zoom capacity. But the Torah waits for no one. So here we go. Let us look at the third preliminary remark that I would like to make is I've started to write a Torah column for the Jerusalem Post each week. Those of you who get off the pulpit will automatically get the Torah column. I post it on Facebook and I post it on Twitter. So if you're on either of those social medias, you'll also see the Torah column. I'll post it each week. And inevitably, it's going to influence what I teach in Thursday morning Torah because it will be the part of the parsha that has particularly gripped me that I will write about. And I don't want to exclusively limit our study to that, but it will certainly impact what we are going to talk about as it will this morning. And this morning, we're studying the parsha of Vayishlach. And Vayishlach begins on Genesis chapter 32, verse 4. And it's Vayishlach because Jacob sends messengers ahead to Esau. Now, we've discussed Jacob and Esau quite a number of times in different contexts, and I'm going to leave that alone for the moment because I don't think that that's it will be as productive to talk about it again. I do want to talk about and the other issue that is a really interesting issue, but again, I think I'm going to leave it aside with just a few remarks, is the rape of Dinah. This raises so many questions of power dynamics, justice, vengeance, anger, male and female relations in ancient times, that to unpack it would take at least a class and more, and it's not what I want to focus on. But the rape of Dinah is a glimpse into a world that is incredibly important to understand the Torah's entire outlook and also its situation in the ancient world, in the sense that in ancient times, you lived in a world in which you were entirely dependent, or almost entirely dependent, either on the good intentions of other people or your own strength. When I walk out into the neighborhood, for example, I am to some extent obviously reliant on the good intentions of other people. If somebody wanted to run up and attack me, they could. But my deeper faith is in the ultimate enforcement of law in a law-abiding society. Now, I know all the caveats and it's never universally true, and all of that is the case. Nonetheless, compared to ancient times, there is no comparison. Those of you who know the work of Steven Pinker and others, in the safest city in the world a couple hundred years ago, the murder rate was 10 times higher, 20 times higher than in the most dangerous section of the most dangerous city in the world today. So the spread of a network of law-abiding, or law enforcement, has been pretty dramatic over the course of human history. And we have to remember, and this is one of the things that the rape of Dinah reminds us, we have to remember that we lived in a world in which if you could not defend yourself, then you either allied yourself with someone who could, or you had to rely on the good nature and the good intentions of the people around you, which I'm sure sometimes worked and I'm sure sometimes did not. And much of the regulation of the Torah is designed for a world in which people are not safe by virtue of societal structures and have to be made safe. Because for a whole variety of reasons, but that's one of the reasons why one of the great advances in justice was I no longer take retribution for what is done to people close to me. Instead, I trust that to be done by a system that is by its nature imperfect, but that I will trust because it is the system's job to take care of this. Since if everybody does vengeance for themselves, you can't have an ordered society. Obviously, when Dinah is raped, especially the brothers Shimon and Levi take vengeance on the town. And then there is also the question of collective punishment. Does the entire town deserve to be punished for what was done by Shechem? And that is an interesting question as well. To what extent is any society responsible for the bad behavior of members of that society? Leaving those very interesting and complex questions aside for the moment, but I did not want to leave them unmentioned, even if I'm leaving them unanswered or unexplored. But leaving them aside for the moment, I do want to turn now to a different section of the Bible, and I think you'll find this very interesting. I really hope you will. I think it's fascinating. Okay, so I'm looking at chapter 35. All right, and thank you for all the messages. I see some messages on Facebook that I am trying to look at while I do this. So. Chapter 35, we're in the middle of the story of Jacob. And really, the story of Jacob is the predominant arc of the narrative until Joseph comes along. It's really about Jacob. It's about Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah and their children and so on, but we're following Jacob. Jacob is the main character. The camera is focused on Jacob, right? If this were a Netflix miniseries, it would be called Jacob. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in chapter 35, verse 8, it says, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak below Beit El. So it was named Alon Bachut, which they translate as the oak of the weeping, but I like much better my own translation, which is tree of tears. Why? Why is her death mentioned? Even Rebekah's death isn't mentioned, actually. Some deaths are mentioned in the Bible and some aren't. Deborah, who's somebody we don't know and haven't met, with one slight exception that I'll get to in a second, why is her death mentioned? And there is a greater mystery, which is, what is this woman doing with Jacob? Why is she there? So let's explore this by going back over the story and remembering who this person is, because there is one other probable mention of her. All right. Rebekah, remember, okay, there's Abraham and Sarah, then Isaac, their son Isaac. Time for Isaac to find a wife. Abraham sends his servant Eliezer off to find a wife. He finds Rebekah. So now he's going to bring Rebekah back to marry Isaac. She leaves her brother's house, comes back to marry Isaac, and it says she came along with her nurse. Now, the nurse is never mentioned, the name is never mentioned there. All we know is that Rebekah came to Isaac with a nurse. We don't even know, is this the nurse of Rebekah's youth? Is that the person who nursed Rebekah? Now she's an older woman. Or is it a nurse who could be Rebecca's age or younger, that comes along because she's going to help Rebecca raise her children. We don't know because the Torah doesn't tell us. All it says is Rebecca came along with her nurse. Okay, you with me so far? I see you all nodding. So Rebecca and her nurse come. Rebecca marries Isaac. She has Jacob and Esau. Don't have to go through all of that. They grow up. Jacob, remember, tricks his father, gets the birthright. Again, don't have to go into that story at the moment. But what is important is when Jacob finds out that Esau wants to kill him, he goes to run away, obviously, right? You're not going to hang around the house if your brother wants to kill you. Although by the end of the pandemic, I think also siblings want to kill their siblings, and you still have to hang around the house. So there are exceptions. But biblically, Esau really meant it. He was really going to kill him. So Jacob is going to run away and does run away. Rebecca says to Jacob at the time, I will come get you. In other words, I won't let you stay running away forever. Sooner or later, I will come and get you. Okay? Now, the question is, why is Deborah now with Jacob? So Rashi, the great medieval commentator, right? Greatest, most cited commentator in Jewish tradition, both for the Talmud and for the Bible, 1040, 1105, Rashi, Troyes, France, says, quoting another rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, he says, the reason that Deborah is now with Jacob, who's grown and is in another city and is far away from Rebecca and Isaac, who are living in Haran, in the old neighborhood, right? The old neighborhood with the old, sitting on the porch, on the rocking chairs in the old neighborhood. They're in Haran. Why is Jacob, who has just gone to Beit El and married and so on, why is Deborah there? So Rashi says Deborah is there because Rebecca sent her to bring Jacob back, as she promised, which she was eventually going to do. And that is one possible reading of why Deborah is there, but it's not my favorite, not even close. I think there's a much more powerful reading, which has a lot to do with human history, with all of us, in ways we don't always understand. Let's assume for a moment that Rebecca raised Jacob. I mean, not Rebecca, that Deborah helped raise Jacob. That Rebecca had this nursemaid, and we know, all of us, that mothers, especially mothers who have gone away from home and are raising children, are in need of the wisdom of people who have raised children. And if Deborah is a nursemaid, she has that wisdom. She knows something about what it is to raise a child. And so she helps Rebecca raise Jacob. Let's assume that that is so, okay? Now, Jacob has run away from home. He's gotten married. He's going to have children. We know something now that the Torah, that people intuited for a long time, but we know that this is true, which is in the first couple of years of life, your brain is making literally millions, and I'm using the word literally. I don't mean literally meaning a lot. Literally millions of connections. In fact, the first few years of life has now been scientifically demonstrated, although intuitive people knew this very well, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. The first few years of life are the decisive years in terms of shaping your brain and the structure of your brain, and therefore your personality and your outlook on the world. We know this from all sorts of studies, both studies of deprivation and studies of enrichment. And some people always knew this. I remember years ago reading in Tolstoy. Tolstoy said, from a child of 5 to myself is not that long a distance, but from 0 to a child of 5 is an appalling distance. In other words, you look at a baby and you look at a 5-year-old, and the difference is extraordinary. But from 5 to an adult, it's just it's an agglomeration and an exaggeration of powers that you can already see are there. But if you saw a baby for the first time and you didn't know anything about babies, you would be amazed that that baby can develop into a child of 5. That being the case, Jacob is shaped by Deborah. This woman, whom we don't know about otherwise, brought Israel from the cradle to the world. Remember, Jacob's other name is Israel. So why is she with him? I think what Ramban Nachmanides suggests makes perfect sense, which is Deborah is there to help raise Jacob's children, because Jacob wants them to have the same kind of enrichment that we have had, that he has had. And the sense that that Deborah has taken care of Jacob's children and that she is so valuable is made clear to us in the way that Marla is asking about. It's made clear to us by the name of the tree under which she's buried, the tree of tears. Because why would Jacob weep for this woman if he didn't feel that she was integral in raising him and making him who he was? And so Deborah becomes a pivotal figure in the shaping of Israel. And the reason that this is so important, even apart from its intrinsic importance, which I think we already can agree to, is this pattern has been repeated over and over and over and over and over again in human history. Women who did not have a public voice, right? By and large, public voices belonged to men. And yet, every time you heard a man express his public voice, what was sometimes unappreciated, but the Torah here is teaching us, is that voice was shaped in the first few years of life by the women who raised him or her. Well, in this case, it's a public voice, him. Because we know that men, this is true even in the Jewish tradition, it's true explicitly in the Talmud, men take over the education of their sons at like age 5 or 6. And before that, women are the ones that educate and shape them, which means that even though you might think the important thing is once you start teaching them X, Y, and Z, the important part of shaping a human being actually is the first few years of life. And Deborah had more to do with who Jacob became in some ways than Isaac ever did, along, of course, with Rebekah. And so I think there is, in a subtle way, that you actually have to look for and pay attention to. I think the Torah here pauses, and remember that the Torah would not pause to note the death of somebody unless it was really significant and really important. In a subtle way, the Torah here pauses to let us know this is important here. This woman's contribution is important. Now, of course, you need to figure out what that contribution was. But that the contribution matters is unquestionable. And that Deborah's teaching of Jacob matters is illustrated both by the severity of the mourning for her and also by the fact that Jacob has her to teach his children, which means that she is in some ways the mother, in quotes, not the biological mother, of the 12 tribes. This woman about whom we know nothing other than that when she died, she's buried under something called the Tree of Tears. And what a powerful symbolic statement it is for women who had no public voice, and yet, again and again and again, they were the ones who enabled people to grow in a way that eventually allowed them to flourish. I quote in the Jerusalem Post column on this a short poem by Robert Louis Stevenson in his Child Garden of Verses, where he talks about Anna Cummings, I think it's Cunningham, who was his nurse, and he calls her the angel of my infant years. The angel of my infant years. And anyone who had any kind of nurse or helper or so on can remember such a person with tremendous affection, but it is obviously also true, and even more true, for mothers throughout history, which is that they shape their children sometimes without the world giving them the credit that they deserve. Now, I want to say one or two more things. First, the interesting part of the end of this section is that it goes on and gives the lineage of Esau, and you ask why all these names would be recorded. And there's lots of speculation about it, since almost none of the names play any role in the subsequent story of the Torah. But I suppose that there is value in acknowledging and marking the names and lives of people. And these people, after all, now, their names at least live for centuries and centuries and millennia because they were recorded in the Torah. And that in and of itself is a powerful statement of the importance and durability of memory. I always think about that when I see obituaries in the paper, for example, and I think that this is the tribute that somebody paid to this person, that they should be at least recorded somewhere and remembered somewhere. And the Torah does that, and this is part of the paradox of Israel and the Torah, is that the enemies of Israel are remembered in history only because they were the enemies of Israel. Amalek would be totally gone in history had they not attacked Israel. So I suppose it was a good career move in a certain way, because that way you get remembered. And it's almost like I happen to be reading Martin Amos's novel Inside Story, and he talks about being in Jerusalem with Saul Bellow. And he doesn't tell this story, but Bellow does in his book To Jerusalem and Back. Bellow had a meeting with Nobel Prize winner Shai Agnon, and Agnon asked Bellow, who was after all by that time world famous, are your books translated into Hebrew? And Bellow said, yes, I think they are. And Agnon said, good, then you're safe. Because as far as Agnon was concerned, English could come and go, but Hebrew was going to be forever. And that seems bizarre, but if you think about it, someone might have said the same thing to the Babylonian Empire. Did you interact with the Jews? Then you're safe. People will remember you, because people remember Babylonian Empire much more because of the destruction of the temple than anything else. Who remembers Nineveh, except for the fact that they interacted? I mean, I suppose people will go to the ruins, but other than that, so the mention of all these people in the lineage of Esau is kind of a beautiful thing, and it reminds us that to interact in some way with the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition is a certain kind of immortality in history. Now, I'm going to, Jennifer asked what books to look at to analyze the Torah. And as you can imagine, it is absolutely endless, the number of books that you can take a look at to analyze the Torah from every different tradition, every different idea, every different ideology. But I will give you a couple for those of you who want to delve in deep. So first of all, get a good copy of the Tanakh, the entire Bible. If you're going to get a Torah, Eitz Chaim is a good one. The Steinsaltz is a good one. Stone is a very traditional one that has a lot of classical Jewish sources in it. And there are many others. There's Robert Alter has one. Most of them the Torah, but you also would want the entire Tanakh. And then there are many different series from different people. Anything from the Anchor Bible series to the Koran series to the on and on and on and on. If you want those who write specifically on the Parsha, I'll make two suggestions, and you can look up their books, and they write different kinds of essays, but both of them are very interesting and very good. One is called The Heart of the Torah. I believe that's the name of it. I'm looking for it on my shelf as I speak to you. Yes, The Heart of Torah by Shai Held, Held. Excellent series. And the other are the books of the recently passed and much lamented Jonathan Sacks. You can look up his books. He has a couple of books on the Parsha that he has written. There are many others who are very worthy and very good. I have a bunch of them, both in Hebrew and in English, and turn to them often. But at least that is a good place to start. And if you, as you will discover, as you look at one, it will lead you on and on and on and on. And they will quote classical sources, so you'll become familiar with the most prominent medieval commentators like Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, and also some later ones like Abravanel, who, and different commentators obviously have different strengths. So Abravanel, whom I mentioned, he served at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, he served as treasurer to Ferdinand and Isabella and was eventually exiled, long story, but he understands, for example, the workings of power much better than most commentators do in Jewish tradition because they had no association with power, and he did. So different commentators give you different things, but all of these and others are useful, at least to get started. Now, just as a setup for what is coming, we are about to enter the longest short story of the Torah, which is the story of Joseph, because this will basically conclude the story of Jacob. The story of Joseph does have an interlude where we tell a short story about Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, but essentially, we're now going to move on to the story of Joseph. And this is a good time to just remind ourselves about the different nature of this book, Genesis, Bereshit in Hebrew, in the beginning, of this book from the rest of the Torah, because Genesis is a family saga, essentially. And the rest of the Torah is the saga of a people. This tells you both that the family is at the core of peoplehood, but also that that the idea, God's idea, is to expand this family into a nation that will in some ways remain a family, but also will become a sort of model to the world in a variety of ways. And at the core of it is family conflict, because remember, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. So there is, even in the center of the story, there is this friction that breeds beauty. And I think that also is part of the central story of Torah and of life, which is that every friction has the potential to breed beauty. It doesn't mean it does, but it has the potential. And we live in that in this very moment, which is that the greatest flourishing of biological scientific genius, maybe in our lifetime, has been the unbelievably fast development of multiple vaccines for something that people said, I don't know if you remember, 9 months ago, any number of people said, oh, we'll never have a vaccine for this. And human ingenuity basically did another moon launch and decided, no, we're going to have a vaccine, and now we do. And I am sure, and this is not my own chokhmah, this is not my own genius that has come up with this point. I am sure, though, as I have seen with messenger RNA and other techniques, that other diseases, including perhaps cancer, will be cured or ameliorated because of the pandemic that caused the development of these kinds of vaccines, accelerated the scientific process far beyond what would have been possible without the pandemic. And that idea that it's what I think it's Rabbi Aharon says, that the eye has a white part and a dark part, and you can only see through the dark part. That in darkness there is this potential for something good and beautiful to happen. This is true. This is true both with what we see in the Torah, in the story of Deborah, in her death. We find this beautiful, even if hidden, reminder of the power and importance of women and the way that they have contributed over the ages in those first years of life and helped shape human history as a result, as well as the story of Joseph, that it was in the friction in the family, which we will get to next week, that this was the slavery and deliverance happened. And the reason this is so apropos to this time of year, of course, is also that we are now, what's today? The 3rd, we are now a week away, I believe, from Hanukkah. I think the first night of Hanukkah is next, if I'm not mistaken, is next Thursday night. And the theme of Hanukkah, of course, is light out of darkness and miracles out of tragedy. And that is exactly what faith is supposed to be. It is supposed to be something that gives one hope in difficult times. And so in some ways, almost every significant story in the Torah is a story of encouragement in times that are not easy. I know, and you know, depending on where you are in the world, and I suspect that most of you are local, although I see, I'm only seeing the Facebook page. Marla Waldman said something about Sefaria. Yeah, Sefaria is an amazing online resource, which you should definitely check out. It has all the texts and it has some commentary. So absolutely, if you have not seen Sefaria, you got to see Sefaria, Sefaria, an incredible online resource, which I'm proud to say that I was on the ground floor at the very beginning, and I know the people who put it together, quite remarkable people, and they've done an amazing job. But I don't remember where I was before I went to Sefaria, but nonetheless, so we have Hanukkah coming, and next week will be the Joseph story, which always comes around Hanukkah. And I know what I was going to say. If you are local, and most of you are, although I see that there are people all over, including overseas, and even a professor of Hebrew Bible, which I'm proud to share this with. Anyway, I was going to say that if you are local, then you know that at least here, things are getting worse pandemic-wise, and you need to be safe. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I hope that soon we will be able to have classes both in person and online. I don't think we'll be giving up the online classes anytime soon. It is, again, one of the blessings that the pandemic has brought is it has increased the reach. And I'm going to make an analogy that I hope you will realize is not a perfect analogy by any means. And I don't mean to suggest that it's analogous in any sense other than the one that I'm talking about. But when the temple was destroyed, Judaism spread around the world. And there is something to be analogized with when the pandemic happened. Judaism got spread around the world in a different way too, because there were these opportunities for people all over the world to see Jewish teachers whom they never would have been exposed to without the pandemic. So, as I said, it's not a perfect analogy, but you get the idea, which is that tragedy often leads to dissemination. And that is certainly what has happened with Torah teaching. So I hope that if you are not on the Off the Pulpit list, that you will get on the Off the Pulpit list. You will get my weekly column, which is always only 200 words, not a lot to read, and my Jerusalem Post column, which is a Torah column, again, 700 words, a little bit more to read, but not that much more. And that you will join us for Shabbat morning services, and that you will join us next week for Thursday morning Torah. Thank you to everybody. Thank you for your questions and your comments, and look forward to studying with you again soon.